What's up everyone and welcome back to the World History Channel. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button today. Let's get started. Things even literature snobs don't know about F. Scott Fitzgerald. Standard F. Scott Fitzgerald biographies usually cover the writer's classic novel, The Great Gatsby, and the basics of his life, including his time in Paris, drinking problem, and marriage to Zelda Fitzgerald. Most accounts, however, leave out the relatively unknown and fascinating details. Widely considered one of the best American writers ever, Fitzgerald was a contradictory and complex figure. The author never graduated from Princeton. He didn't always get along with Ernest Hemingway, and despite embodying the East Coast jazz age, he hailed from the Midwest. F. Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald appeared to live the high life in New York City, but issues plagued their marriage. F's frequently overlooked particulars. Scott Fitzgerald's life provide a fuller picture of the man behind a required reading favorite. His first professional job involved writing advertising jingles. After dropping out of Princeton and leaving the Army, Fitzgerald took up his first professional job at an advertising agency in New York City. He wrote jingles for the company during the day and worked on his novels and short stories in the evening. "We keep you clean in Muscatine" was one of his most successful slogans for a steam laundry company in Iowa. His boss deemed the copy a bit imaginative. He worked as a screenwriter for MGM. After heading to Los Angeles in 1937, Fitzgerald spent the latter part of his career in Hollywood as a screenwriter for MGM. He doctored existing scripts to improve them, but his work mostly went uncredited. None of his original scripts became movies, and he earned only a single film credit, which was for a film titled Three Comrades, a 1938 adaptation of an eponymous novel by Erich Maria Remarque. Publishers rejected his first novel twice. Publisher Charles Scribner's Sons twice rejected Fitzgerald's first manuscript, The Romantic Egoist. He rewrote it both times according to the encouraging notes he received from the publisher, then gave it a new title, This Side of Paradise. The third time proved to be the charm, as it was finally worthy of publication. Fitzgerald and Zelda married a week after This Side of Paradise was published in March 1920. He wrote detective stories for his high school newspaper. Fitzgerald began writing when he was young, and his first published works were for his high school newspaper. However, he didn't write news stories or journalistic accounts. Instead, he wrote detective stories and reportedly started focusing more on his writing than schoolwork. This may be seen by some as a surprising beginning for a writer, who later came to be associated with classic literature. He had a high-profile affair while his wife was in a psychiatric hospital. While Zelda was in a sanitarium in the late 1930s, her husband had a high-profile affair with Sheila Graham, a newspaper gossip columnist who met Fitzgerald when he was trying to make it as a screenwriter in Hollywood. According to Graham, she stayed with Fitzgerald through his binges and was with him when he passed from a heart attack in 1940. 17 years later, she started co-writing a book with a man named Gerald Frank about her affair with Fitzgerald, beloved infidel. He never graduated from college. Fitzgerald entered Princeton in September 1913, but left to enlist in the Army before completing his degree. According to his report card, he was in the lowest tier of classes and did not receive an A in his language arts courses. He was a member of the Triangle Club, which staged plays, and he wrote a lot and found inspiration there. He dropped out of college after 3 years to join the military. He participated in World War I and never left the United States. Fitzgerald left Princeton 1 year shy of graduating to enlist in the U.S. Army. During this time, World War I was underway in Europe, and the U.S. had begun its war effort by sending troops overseas in 1917. Commissioned as a second lieutenant, Fitzgerald was stationed outside Montgomery, Alabama. The war ended on November 11, 1918, and he never left the country or saw combat. He saved all of the letters from his first love, even after he insisted she destroy his. Fitzgerald was first in love with Ginevra King. The two met when they were teenagers. He was a 19-year-old Princeton student, and she, 3 years his junior, was still in high school. For 2 years they wrote love letters to each other, but when the romance ended, Fitzgerald insisted King throw away all of the notes he had sent her. She did, under the condition that he destroyed hers as well. He, however, didn't follow through. He kept them and bound them together to make a book. 10 years after Fitzgerald's death, his daughter returned King's letters, which were then donated to the Princeton University Library. He perished as a commercial and critical failure. Famous works like The Great Gatsby, Tender is the Night, and The Beautiful and Damned were written by Fitzgerald, who is adored. His books are an important part of high school curricula across the country, but his oeuvre didn't earn him much money while he was alive. When Fitzgerald passed, he considered himself a commercial and critical failure. After he passed away, decades later, neither his writings nor his popularity reached such extraordinary heights. Few people attended his funeral. Before transitioning back to screenwriting in 1937, Fitzgerald became consumed by his depression and alcoholism for about 2 years. During this time, he also struggled with writer's block. He died when he was 44 years old. There were few people at his funeral, and his wife, Zelda, could not attend the service because of health issues. Zelda had reservations about marrying him. Zelda Fitzgerald, formerly Zelda Sayer, was the daughter of a judge in Montgomery, Alabama. She grew up in a family that belonged to the upper class, and she had privileges all her life. Fitzgerald couldn't offer Zelda the same lavish lifestyle. Thus, she had serious reservations about marrying him and turned down his initial proposal. She finally agreed to marry Fitzgerald after a publisher accepted his first novel, This Side of Paradise, for publication. He spent some of his formative years and adulthood in Minnesota. Fitzgerald was born in St. Paul, Minnesota, and quickly relocated to upstate New York. Before he was a teenager, he and his family moved back to St. Paul because his father had lost his job. As an adult, Fitzgerald returned to live in St. Paul with his wife, Zelda. His roots were seemingly in the Midwest, which contrasted the East Coast elite image that some believe he projected. He was named after Francis Scott Key, writer of the national anthem. Francis Scott Key Fitzgerald was his full name. His parents named him after the writer of The Star-Spangled Banner and distant cousin, Francis Scott Key, who was technically his second cousin, 3 times removed on his dad's side. Fitzgerald usually went by Scott instead of his first name. F. Scott Fitzgerald is often remembered as the poster child for the jazz age. Slick, sophisticated, and saturated in champagne, but the man behind The Great Gatsby was far more complex, contradictory, and at times heartbreaking than the glittering image most readers imagine. Even literary snobs can tell you that he drank too much, partied with Zelda, and died thinking he was a failure. However, they rarely delve beneath the mythology to find out the strange, less well-known aspects of his life that made him one of America's most famous writers. For instance, before becoming the chronicler of Roaring Twenties decadence, Fitzgerald found himself crafting quirky advertising jingles in a New York agency office, penning oddball lines like, "We keep you clean in Muscatine," a bizarre slogan for a steam laundry in Iowa that his boss considered a little too imaginative, and thus began his professional writing career. He wasn't an East Coast aristocrat, though he played one on the page. He was born in the rougher climes of St. Paul, Minnesota, and later went back there with Zelda. His supposed old money sensibility was surprisingly rooted in his modest Midwestern upbringing. He never actually graduated from Princeton. He dropped out and enlisted in the Army before he could get a diploma. However, he did manage to make a name for himself in the university's theater troupe, the Triangle Club, where he used his early creative energy to write musical comedies rather than term papers. Regarding his time in the military, Fitzgerald never even made it overseas, despite the fact that he liked to think of himself as a member of the Great War generation. He was stationed in Alabama during World War I and spent much of his time there courting the Southern belle Zelda Sayer, whose father, a stern Montgomery judge, considered the struggling young writer beneath her, a sentiment Zelda initially shared. She rejected Fitzgerald's first marriage proposal until his debut novel was accepted for publication, essentially treating This Side of Paradise as his dowry. By the way, that book was only published after Fitzgerald rewrote it 3 times. It was originally titled The Romantic Egoist, but Charles Scribner's sons turned it down twice before giving him the go-ahead on his 3rd attempt. The novel's success was immediate and intoxicating, launching the Fitzgeralds into a whirlwind lifestyle of opulence and dysfunction, a duality that plagued their relationship until the end. Zelda's mental health rapidly deteriorated, leading to institutionalization, and Scott began a love affair with Hollywood gossip columnist Sheila Graham during one of her long stints in a sanitarium. This is something that few literary biographies emphasize: how grotesquely tragic the Fitzgeralds' marriage became. Though scandalous, the relationship was one of his most stable in later years, and Graham stood by him through his alcoholic spirals and crushing professional disappointments, ultimately holding his hand as he died of a heart attack at just 44 years old in her apartment. Fitzgerald was broke, his books were out of print, and his time in Hollywood. He worked for MGM and mostly ghost rewrote scripts, only resulted in one official screen credit, the adaptation of Eric Maria Remarque's Three Comrades. By that point, his career had gone downhill. His original scripts went nowhere, and despite his talent, the industry seemed to view him as damaged goods. What's more, during his lowest point, he struggled with severe writer's block and drank heavily, losing years to creative paralysis and deepening despair. His funeral was a somber affair, sparsely attended. Zelda, institutionalized and unwell, couldn't come. Few outside of close friends seemed to care that one of America's great literary minds had perished. Even as a teenager, Fitzgerald exhibited the idiosyncratic flair that would later define him, writing detective stories, not the usual student editorials, for his high school newspaper. His imaginative bent was visible from early on, and it's telling that he prioritized storytelling over schoolwork, foreshadowing a lifelong pattern of obsessive focus on fiction at the expense of daily responsibilities. That same pattern reappeared with Ginevra King, his first love and a Chicago socialite whose letters he preserved like relics, even after demanding she destroy his own. He couldn't let go of the past and instead bound her letters into a manuscript, hoarding her affection like a museum piece. Decades later, his daughter Frances returned the letters to Ginevra, who donated them to Princeton's library, closing the loop on a literary obsession that predated Zelda by years and arguably inspired Daisy Buchanan. Despite writing what many now consider the great American novel, Fitzgerald died a critical and commercial failure. The Great Gatsby, published in 1925, sold poorly during his lifetime, and critics were largely indifferent. It wasn't until after World War II, thanks in part to inclusion in military book programs, that Gatsby became the pillar of American literature it's known as today. That ironic twist, his greatest work ignored until after his death, is one of many Fitzgerald paradoxes. Another. He became the talk of Manhattan in the 1920s, but he never quite fit the East Coast elite he portrayed with such sharp elegance. In fact, his outsider status gave him an edge. He understood the appeal and rot of high society better than those born into it, precisely because he spent his life trying to gain their approval. And though he's considered the poet of the lost generation, his friendship with Ernest Hemingway was fraught. Fitzgerald admired Hemingway's prose but felt stung by his personal attacks, particularly those that were published in memoirs like A Movable Feast, while Hemingway found Fitzgerald to be weak and resented his dependence on Zelda. Their toxic camaraderie is legendary, but many miss the nuance. Fitzgerald introduced Hemingway to Scribner's, essentially launching his career, a generosity Hemingway never fully acknowledged. Then there's the matter of Fitzgerald's relationship with money, a theme central to his fiction and his life. He was perennially broke, not just because of his drinking or Zelda's hospital bills, but because he lived beyond his means in a desperate attempt to maintain the illusion of success. He often churned out short stories for magazines like the Saturday Evening Post, not for artistic fulfillment but simply to pay rent, work he called whoring, though it paid far more than his novels ever did. He was haunted by this compromise, and despite their brilliant execution, many of those short stories were written under duress and with self-loathing. Despite the wealth of myths surrounding his name, Fitzgerald was far more vulnerable, insecure, and tragically self-aware than most literary snobs like to admit. Despite meticulously documenting his flaws and intimate knowledge of them, he was never able to overcome them. His alcoholism was destructive rather than romantic. His marriage wasn't glamorous. It was chaotic and often cruel. His genius wasn't effortless. It came with agony and shame. Even his name was borrowed prestige. He was christened Francis Scott Key Fitzgerald after the man who wrote The Star-Spangled Banner, a distant relative who bestowed patriotic grandeur upon a boy who would spend his life feeling unworthy of it. In the end, Fitzgerald's life was a mix of ambition, addiction, brilliance, heartbreak, and longing. It was a perfect reflection of the time period he immortalized, but it was also a cautionary tale about the cost of chasing dreams with too much fire and not enough armor. He wanted to be great, and he was, but he never got to see it. That might be the most heartbreaking thing even literature snobs don't know about F. Scott Fitzgerald. That the man who gave us Gatsby's green light never reached his own. He died thinking he had failed, and maybe that's why his ghost lingers so vividly in American letters, always whispering from between the lines, reminding us that genius rarely looks like we expect, and that the brightest stars often burn out long before the world learns their names. Things nobody, not even literature snobs, knows about F. Scott Fitzgerald. F. Scott Fitzgerald is still one of the most well-known figures in American literature. He is known for writing The Great Gatsby, a book that has become synonymous with the American dream and chronicling the jazz age. Yet, beyond the well-trodden narratives of his turbulent marriage to Zelda, his rivalry with Ernest Hemingway, and his struggles with alcoholism, lies a wealth of lesser-known details that paint a far more nuanced portrait of the man. Fitzgerald's life was full of paradoxes. He was from the Midwest but embodied East Coast glamour. He dropped out of Princeton but went on to become a literary giant, and he died believing he was a failure only to become immortal after his death. His story is one of ambition, loss, rebirth, and perseverance. 1. His first professional job, writing advertising jingles. Before Fitzgerald became the voice of the lost generation, he was a struggling young writer trying to make ends meet in New York City. After dropping out of Princeton and leaving the Army, he took a job at the Baron Collier Advertising Agency in 1919, where he wrote slogans and jingles for various products. One of his most famous, or infamous, creations was for a steam laundry company in Muscatine, Iowa. "We keep you clean in Muscatine." His boss reportedly found the line a bit imaginative, a critique that foreshadowed Fitzgerald's later struggles with commercial expectations versus artistic ambition. Despite the fact that he detested advertising work and referred to it as the racket, he learned how to craft concise, resonant phrases, a skill that would later define his prose. 2. Hollywood dreams and disasters. His uncredited screenwriting career. Fitzgerald's literary stature had diminished by the late 1930s. Plagued by debt, alcoholism, and declining book sales, he turned to Hollywood as a last resort. In 1937, he signed a contract with Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer (MGM) for $1,000 a week, a substantial sum during the Great Depression. However, he was frustrated throughout his time in Tinseltown. Studio executives found his writing too literary for mainstream audiences, and most of his scripts were heavily rewritten or discarded. His only credited screenplay was for Three Comrades, 1938. An adaptation of Eric Maria Remarque's novel, though even this was significantly altered by another writer. Fitzgerald's unfinished novel, The Last Tycoon, based on his Hollywood experiences, was a poignant exploration of the industry's allure and cruelty, a world that both fascinated and destroyed him. 3. The rocky road to publication, rejection and reinvention. Before The Great Gatsby cemented his legacy, Fitzgerald faced repeated rejection. His first novel, The Romantic Egoist, was twice rejected by Charles Scribner's Sons. The publisher, while unimpressed with the manuscript, saw potential in Fitzgerald's voice and encouraged him to revise it. He did twice, before finally retitling it This Side of Paradise. When it was published in March 1920, the novel became an instant sensation, capturing the disillusionment of post-World War I youth. The book's success was so immediate that Fitzgerald and Zelda married a week later, banking on his newfound literary fame to sustain their extravagant lifestyle. For his early writings, from detective stories to literary greatness long before Gatsby, Fitzgerald was honing his craft in an unexpected genre, detective fiction. As a student at St. Paul Academy and later Newman School, he wrote mystery stories for his school newspaper, showcasing an early flair for narrative and dialogue. These juvenilia, though far from the sophistication of his later work, reveal his innate storytelling instincts. His teachers noted his talent but also his lack of discipline, a trait that would haunt him throughout his life. 5. The affair with Sheila Graham. A complicated final chapter. While Zelda was institutionalized for mental illness in the late 1930s, Fitzgerald began a relationship with Sheila Graham, a British gossip columnist in Hollywood. Unlike Zelda, Graham was pragmatic and self-made, a stark contrast to the Southern belle who had once been Fitzgerald's muse. Their affair was tumultuous, marked by Fitzgerald's erratic behavior and worsening health. Graham later claimed she was with him when he died of a heart attack in 1940, holding his hand as he muttered his last words. "Sheila, don't worry. I'm going to live." 17 years later, she co-wrote Beloved Infidel, a memoir about their relationship, further complicating Fitzgerald's posthumous image. 6. The graduate of Princeton who never quits learning. Fitzgerald's academic career was far from illustrious. He entered Princeton in 1913 but was a lackluster student, more interested in writing for the Princeton Tiger and the Nassau Literary Magazine than his coursework. His grades were mediocre. He never earned an A in English, and he left in 1917 without graduating to enlist in the Army during World War I. Despite this, Princeton remained a touchstone in his life. He set parts of this side of paradise there and often returned to the campus in later years, seeking intellectual camaraderie. 7. A soldier who never saw combat. Fitzgerald's military service was another paradox. He enlisted in the First World War and received a commission as a second lieutenant, but the war ended before he was sent overseas. He revised The Romantic Egoist and courted Zelda Sayre while he was at Camp Sheridan in Alabama. His only brush with war's aftermath came later, when he wrote about shell-shocked veterans in Tender is the Night. 8. The letters he couldn't bear to destroy.